The Wendigoon's Path. There was something in the woods, something older than the trees themselves, something that wandered the shadows when the night was deep. But for the longest time, no one knew what it was, only that it lurked just beyond the reach of the campfire's light. That was until one fateful evening when it came closer than anyone ever expected. It had been a long day, the air heavy with the smell of pine and earth. The sun dipped behind the mountain peaks as the group gathered around the fire at their campsite, nestled at the edge of the forest. There was no moon tonight, just a wide expanse of stars, a glittering blanket that offered little comfort. "You ever wonder what's out there?" Jared asked, poking at the fire with a stick. His voice was light, almost playful, but there was an edge of something else. Curiosity, maybe a hint of unease. Marissa, seated next to him, chuckled. "You mean, besides the usual wildlife? Bears, wolves, maybe a deer or two?" "Yeah," Jared replied, his eyes darting nervously to the darkened trees. "But sometimes it feels like there's something watching, something that shouldn't be here." The group laughed at that, shaking their heads. Another one of Jared's silly thoughts, they assumed. He had a tendency to get spooked by the simplest things, but as the fire crackled and popped, something in the air seemed to change, a subtle shift, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. "I don't know," said Lucas, always the more serious one. "I've heard stories, old tales from the locals." "What kind of stories?" Marissa asked. Lucas glanced over at the dark woods, his face briefly illuminated by the firelight. "The Wendigoon," he said, lowering his voice. "It's an old legend, something that roams these woods." Jared rolled his eyes. "Here we go. Some creepy bedtime story?" "Not a story," Lucas insisted, his tone now stern. "The Wendigoon is real. It's an ancient creature, a predator. It's been around for as long as the woods have been here." The air around them seemed to grow heavier, the wind stilled as if listening. Jared leaned forward. "So, what is it? A bear? A Bigfoot?" Lucas shook his head. "No, it's worse than that. It's something else. They say it was once a man, but twisted, cursed by some ancient force. It feeds on fear, on isolation. It has the ability to mimic voices, lure people deep into the woods, and then..." He paused, his eyes flicking to the trees, as if the mere thought of the creature made him uneasy. "Then what?" Marissa asked, a little too interested now. Lucas leaned closer. "And then it takes them, vanishes them without a trace. The ones who are taken are never seen again. No body, no sign, just gone." The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and for a moment no one spoke. The stories of old were just that. Stories, weren't they? But the darkness in the woods felt deeper now. The shadows stretched further. That night, when everyone had settled into their tents, the wind began to rise. It started as a whisper, barely audible over the rustling leaves, but then it grew into something louder, more insistent. It carried with it a strange, hollow cry, distant, almost human. Jared woke first, disoriented by the sound. He unzipped his tent, squinting into the night. The wind howled through the trees, bending branches in unnatural ways. The fire was nothing more than glowing embers, and the rest of the campsite was eerily still. Then he heard it again. A voice, soft, almost pleading. "Jared, Jared!" His heart raced. The voice sounded so familiar, so much like Marissa's, but something about it was off, too strained, too unnatural. He rushed to the other tents, shaking each one awake. "Did you hear that?" he asked, panic rising in his chest. "What?" Lucas groggily replied, rubbing his eyes. "What's going on?" "That voice, it was calling my name." Lucas stiffened, and Marissa, now fully awake, sat up in alarm. "The Wendigoon," she whispered. Her voice was tremulous. "It mimics voices, lures you in. We need to leave. Now." But it was too late. The wind shifted, and the air grew cold. The trees seemed to sway in unnatural patterns, bending as though something was moving among them. From the depths of the forest, they heard a low, guttural growl, and then the shape emerged. At first, it was a shadow, indistinct against the backdrop of the forest, but as it drew closer, they could make out the shape of something tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long and thin for its body. Its head was enormous, but featureless, just a black void. The creature moved with unnatural grace, gliding rather than walking, its feet making no sound on the forest floor. Jared took a step back, heart hammering in his chest. "What the hell is that?" he gasped. "That's the Wendigoon," Lucas whispered. "Run. Now." But it was already too late. The creature's mouth, if it could even be called that, split open, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It let out a horrific screech, like 1,000 voices crying out in agony, and then, in a blur of motion, it lunged at them. Marissa screamed, and the others scattered in different directions, but the Wendigoon was faster. It moved like a shadow, its long limbs stretching unnaturally, reaching out for them. It was upon them in an instant, and everything went dark. When Jared woke again, he was lying on the cold, damp earth. The fire was gone, and the trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels. He scrambled to his feet, heart racing. Marissa and Lucas were nowhere to be seen. His breath came in shallow gasps, his mind spinning with what had just happened. Was it real? Was it a nightmare? He staggered to the edge of the clearing, and there, in the distance, he saw the shape again, standing still, watching him with its empty, faceless gaze. It hadn't taken them. Not yet. But it would. It always took what it wanted. Jared ran, his legs burning as he sprinted into the woods, but no matter how fast he went, the sound of the creature's hollow cry echoed behind him, growing closer with every step. And in the darkest corner of his mind, a whisper began. "Jared, Jared, come closer," the Wendigoon was calling. There was an unease that lingered in the air of the small town of Black Hollow. Nestled between ancient, towering trees and a maze of forgotten trails, it was a place where time seemed to move differently, where the world outside rarely intruded. Most of the locals knew each other by name, by face, by history. But there was one thing they never spoke of, the thing that lived in the woods. It was an old legend, passed down in whispers, mostly dismissed by the younger generation as myth. But for those who still remembered the stories, there was a quiet understanding. The Wendigoon was real, and it was patient. Caleb Harper had heard the stories his entire life, but like most young people, he had always dismissed them as superstition. He was a man of reason, logic, and science until that night. It started innocently enough. Caleb had been hiking through the woods with his dog, Molly. It was a crisp evening, the kind of late fall day where the sun dipped low behind the trees, casting long, dark shadows. He loved the solitude, the peacefulness of nature. Molly, an old golden retriever, trotted ahead of him, sniffing the underbrush as they ventured deeper into the wilderness. They'd been out here countless times, but today, something felt different. The woods were quieter than usual. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, no distant calls from the animals that typically inhabited the area. Just a silence that made Caleb's skin prickle. "Molly," he called, but the dog didn't respond. She had wandered off, deeper into the trees. Caleb sighed and followed her, calling again. "Molly!" His voice was louder this time, sharp with frustration. But still there was no answer. When he reached a small clearing, he finally saw her. Standing still, her head cocked to the side as if listening for something. The hair on the back of Caleb's neck stood on end. There was something wrong, something unnatural in the way Molly stood there. Then he heard it too. A soft, low hum, like wind moving through the trees, but it was far too rhythmic, a whisper, faint, yet unmistakable. The sound grew louder, more distinct, and it was then that Caleb realized it wasn't the wind. It was something else. "Molly, come here," Caleb said, his voice tense as he took a step forward. But the dog didn't move. Instead, she let out a soft whine and backed away slowly, her eyes wide with terror. Caleb's heart pounded as he stepped closer, his eyes scanning the darkening trees. And then, just on the edge of the clearing, he saw it. At first, it was just a shape, a tall, dark silhouette standing perfectly still. As his eyes adjusted to the dimming light, the figure became clearer. It was impossibly tall, with long limbs that stretched unnaturally, like branches of a twisted tree. Its skin was pale, almost sickly, and its face, if you could even call it a face, was a featureless mass of shadow, save for two glowing yellow eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. The creature was watching him. A chill ran down Caleb's spine, and a voice, an eerie, low murmur, drifted to him, though no words were spoken. It was more like a feeling, a presence in his mind. It called to him, a whisper that crawled beneath his skin and seeped into his thoughts. "Come closer, Caleb." He froze. The voice, it sounded like his name, but distorted, warped by something ancient and malevolent. "Get away from it, Molly," Caleb whispered, his voice cracking as he turned to run. But when he looked back to where Molly had been, the dog was gone. Panic set in. "Molly?" he shouted, but there was no answer. His breath quickened as he turned back to face the Wendigoon. Its eyes glowed brighter now, piercing through the dark like twin lanterns. It moved slightly, its limbs jerking at unnatural angles, like it was not quite in sync with the world around it. Caleb's heart raced as he stumbled backward, but it was too late. The creature had already begun to move toward him, its long legs dragging the ground in sickening silence. Caleb's mind screamed at him to run, but his body wouldn't obey. The thing's eyes locked onto his, and the world seemed to narrow, until there was nothing but the Wendigoon and him. It stepped closer, and the whisper in his mind grew louder, more insistent. "Come closer. I won't bite. I just want to play." His feet were frozen in place, sweat dripped down his forehead, and his mouth went dry. But somehow the creature's presence felt familiar. He knew it. He had seen it before, at least in his dreams. The Wendigoon was a creature from another time, another world. It didn't belong here, not in this dimension. It was something old, something that had existed long before mankind, and it had learned to thrive in the darkness. It fed on fear, on the loneliness of those who wandered too far into its domain. And Caleb had wandered too far. The creature let out a low, rasping sound, its chest heaving. It was laughing, not with a mouth, but with a deep, unnatural echo that seemed to reverberate through the very air. Caleb's chest tightened, and for the first time, he realized something terrible. The Wendigoon didn't just want to kill him. It wanted him to be afraid. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, Caleb broke free from the creature's gaze. He ran, stumbling over roots and rocks as he tore through the forest. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he didn't dare stop. He could hear the creature behind him, its limbs crackling like dry wood with every step as it pursued him with an unholy speed. The hum of the Wendigoon's voice filled his ears again, louder now, a cacophony of whispers urging him to slow down, to stop, to give in. But Caleb pushed through, his mind racing as he thought of his home, of the warmth of his bed, of the safety he once took for granted. When he finally stumbled into the clearing where his car was parked, he was out of breath, covered in dirt and sweat and shaking. But the Wendigoon was gone. The woods were still, silent once more. Caleb collapsed into the driver's seat of his car, slamming the door behind him. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the keys, starting the engine. As he pulled away from the forest, he glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature watching from the tree line. There was nothing. But deep down, Caleb knew the truth. The Wendigoon was still there, waiting, just beyond the reach of the roads and the lights. It was patient, and when the time was right, it would call to him again. And next time, it wouldn't let him run. The Wendigoon's Trail. The small town of Eldridge sat nestled in the valley, surrounded by dense woods that no one dared enter. It was the kind of place where secrets hid behind every rotting tree, and the air always smelled of damp earth. The locals rarely spoke about the woods, except in hushed tones, but every child knew the story of the Wendigoon. Tommy Lee was no child anymore, but the stories had stuck with him, as they always did with people who grew up in places like Eldridge. He had heard the tales from his grandfather and his father and everyone who lived in that town. The Wendigoon was real, but no one could agree on what it actually was. Some said it was a creature with too many limbs. Others claimed it was an ancient spirit that had long ago escaped the realms of the living. Tommy wasn't sure which version of the story was true. All he knew was that it was the one thing in Eldridge that was never laughed off. But the stories didn't scare him anymore. He had grown up and left Eldridge, building a life in the city, working a desk job that didn't demand much more than a steady hand and an occasional smile. He'd heard about the disappearances, the strange things that had happened to people who ventured into the woods, but that was all behind him now. He had dissed himself from the small town superstitions until one day, Tommy got a call that made him return. His father had passed away, leaving behind a house filled with memories of a life that Tommy had mostly forgotten. He hadn't seen Eldridge in years, and the thought of returning filled him with an odd mix of nostalgia and dread. But there was no choice. He had to go back to bury the man who had always warned him to stay away from the woods. After the funeral, Tommy found himself standing at the edge of the forest, staring into the thickening trees. The wind had picked up, howling through the branches in a way that almost sounded like a voice. He told himself it was nothing. He was a grown man now, no longer a child terrified by campfire stories. Yet, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. He had come back to sort out his father's things, but Tommy felt a strange pull toward the forest. There was something unresolved, a lingering sense that his past wasn't finished with him. It was then that he heard the whisper. At first, it was a soft sound, almost like wind moving through the leaves, but then it became more distinct. It sounded like a voice he recognized. Tommy. Tommy. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. He turned around, expecting to see someone standing behind him, but there was no one. Just the trees, swaying in the breeze. The voice came again. Tommy. He stepped back, instinctively reaching for his phone. There was no signal out here, of course, no way to call for help. But as he looked into the shadows of the woods, he felt an irrational fear settle in his chest. The stories flooded his mind, memories from his childhood of the Wendigoon's call, the way it would mimic the voices of loved ones to draw people into the forest. Tommy, it's safe now, his father's voice. But how could it be? His father had passed away less than a day ago. He was buried in the cemetery. He had heard the earth fall onto the casket. The voice was real. It was his father's voice. Stop it, Tommy muttered to himself, shaking his head. This was ridiculous. This was exactly the sort of thing his father would warn him about. Something designed to trick him, to lure him into the woods. But the voice, it sounded so real, so desperate. And now there was something else. A deep, guttural growl that came from the forest's depths. The ground beneath his feet trembled, ever so slightly. Something was out there. Dad? Tommy whispered into the stillness, his voice cracking. The voice answered, low and hollow, "Come closer." Against every instinct in his body, Tommy stepped forward. Each step felt like a betrayal, but the pull of the voice was too strong. It was like a thread tying him to the darkness, urging him forward, deeper into the trees. The growl grew louder, and soon he could hear the sound of something moving in the underbrush. Too large, too quick to be any normal animal. He stumbled over roots and rocks, his breath coming fast and shallow. The deeper he went, the more the forest seemed to close in around him. The trees, once towering, now felt oppressive, their gnarled branches bending inward like claws reaching for him. The whispers grew louder, the voice now calling out in an eerie, distorted version of his father's words. Tommy, come closer. It's time. A branch snapped behind him. He whirled around, expecting to see someone, anything, but there was nothing, only darkness. The trees, the shadows, the thick air that felt heavier with each breath. And then he saw it. A shape, moving just beyond the moonlight. It was too tall, far too tall, with limbs that bent and swayed unnaturally. It moved toward him with slow, deliberate steps, its face a twisted, featureless mass of shadow with two glowing yellow eyes fixed on him, gazed at him from the edge of the forest. The Wendigoon. It was real. Tommy froze, terror locking his body in place. The creature's limbs stretched unnaturally, twisting as it moved toward him, and the growl, the voice, echoed louder, now intertwined with the voice of his father. Come to me, Tommy. Come to me, my son. It was mimicking his father's voice again, but something was wrong. This wasn't his father. It couldn't be. His father was gone. Dad? Tommy whispered, but his voice was drowned out by the creature's growl. It was closer now, so close he could see the details. Its skin, pale and waxy, stretched thin across its bones, its mouth opening too wide to be human. The thing's breath came in jagged gasps like a predator savoring its prey, and then it spoke again, louder than before. I'm your father now. Tommy turned and ran. Every fiber of his being screamed to run, to escape. He could hear the Wendigoon behind him, its heavy footsteps pounding the ground, but he didn't dare look back. The voice was still calling, but now it was mixed with a horrible, mocking laugh. He wasn't sure how long he ran or how far, but eventually the forest began to thin. The sounds of the creature faded into the distance. His legs burned, his body trembling, but he pushed forward. Finally, he reached the road, his feet stumbling onto the dirt path that led back into town. The trees fell silent behind him, the oppressive weight lifting as he crossed the boundary between the woods and the safety of the familiar, sunless town. Tommy collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, his heart pounding. But as he sat there, the wind picked up again. and in the distance he swore he heard the voice one last time, a whisper carried by the breeze. "It's not over." The Wendigoon's return. It had been a quiet year in the small town of Pine Hollow, a year without the strange disappearances, the unsettling whispers in the woods, and the eerie tales of a creature that stalked the forest's edge. The townspeople had almost convinced themselves that the Wendigoon was nothing but a myth, a story told to scare children, a relic of superstition. But when Sarah Quinn returned to Pine Hollow, everything changed. Sarah had left the town nearly a decade ago, seeking a life beyond the fog-choked woods that had once seemed to swallow everything in sight. She'd built a new life in the city, far away from the quiet isolation of Pine Hollow. She had nearly forgotten the fear that clung to her every step when she was young, the feeling that something unnatural was always watching. But that was before her brother, Ely, disappeared. She hadn't been back to Pine Hollow since the day he vanished into the woods. The official story was that he'd gotten lost while hiking, wandered too far, and was claimed by the forest. The search teams never found his body, and no one ever spoke of it again. But Sarah knew better. She knew Ely hadn't wandered off. She had heard the stories, just like everyone else. She had heard the warnings of the Wendigoon. When she returned to the town, it was under the guise of settling her brother's affairs, the house he'd lived in, his belongings, his unfinished business. But Sarah knew there was something else she had to do. She had to face the forest, face the thing that had taken Ely. She couldn't rest until she knew what had happened to him. The sun was setting as Sarah drove through the winding roads that led to Pine Hollow. The trees on either side seemed to press in, their dark limbs stretching like fingers reaching toward the car. The familiar, oppressive weight of the forest settled over her, the air thick with the smell of damp leaves and pine resin. She could feel the unease creeping into her bones, but she pushed it aside. She was here for a reason, and she couldn't afford to be afraid. Her old childhood home still stood at the edge of the town, a dilapidated two-story house that looked as though it had been swallowed by the forest itself. The windows were covered in dust, the porch sagging under years of neglect. It hadn't changed much, and yet everything felt different. The air felt heavier, more charged, as though the land itself was holding its breath. That night, after settling into the house, Sarah stood at the front window, staring into the blackness of the trees. The wind whispered through the branches, and somewhere deep in the woods she heard a sound, a low, guttural growl, like a distant thunderstorm rumbling beneath the earth. Sarah shivered. The sound reminded her of the things she had tried so hard to forget. The Wendigoon. She had always known it was real. Even as a child, the warnings had been clear. Never go into the woods alone. Never stray too far from the safety of the town. Never, under any circumstances, follow a voice calling your name. But the stories had always seemed so far-fetched, so strange. That was before Ely. Before she realized that whatever the Wendigoon was, it was far more than just a monster. Unable to sleep, Sarah grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The cold night air hit her like a wave, and she pulled her coat tighter around her. She stood for a moment, listening. The woods were quiet now, eerily so. But then, she heard it. A voice. Sarah. Her heart skipped a beat. It was her brother's voice. His voice. But it was wrong. The tone, the way it echoed in the stillness, it wasn't the same. It wasn't him. "Sarah, come to me," the voice whispered. "I'm waiting." Sarah's blood ran cold. She had heard this before, when Ely had gone missing. She had heard the voice calling him into the woods, the same way it was calling her now. The Wendigoon. It mimicked voices. It used them to lure people into the forest, to take them, to feed on their fear. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. She wanted to turn back, to run inside and lock the door, to pretend that this was all a bad dream, but she knew she couldn't. She had to know what had happened to Ely. She had to face the thing that had taken him. With a deep breath, Sarah stepped off the porch and into the woods. The path through the trees was faint, barely visible beneath the layers of fallen leaves. But Sarah knew it. She had walked these paths as a child, had explored every corner of the forest with Ely. But this time, the woods felt different, darker, alive in a way that made her skin crawl. As she walked deeper, the voice called to her again, closer this time, but still distorted, as though coming from all directions at once. Sarah. She shivered, gripping the flashlight tightly in her hand. The trees seemed to close in around her, their twisted branches reaching down like fingers, brushing against her face. The wind picked up again, and with it came the sound of something moving in the distance, something large, something unnatural. Sarah's breath quickened as she picked up her pace. She had to find it. She had to find Eli, or at least the truth. But the deeper she went, the more disoriented she became. The forest twisted in strange ways. Paths that should have been familiar now led her in circles. The growl was louder now, closer. And the voice, it wasn't just Eli's anymore. It had become a chorus of distorted voices, all calling her name, urging her forward, pulling her deeper into the heart of the woods. Finally, after what felt like hours, Sarah stumbled into a clearing. In the center stood a tree, an ancient, gnarled oak that seemed to stretch far higher than any other tree in the forest. Beneath its roots was a hole, a dark, gaping maw that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. And standing beside it was the Wendigoon. Its limbs were impossibly long, twisting in unnatural angles. Its face, if you could call it that, was a smooth, featureless mass, with two glowing yellow eyes that bored into her soul. The creature's mouth stretched open in a grotesque, silent grin, as if it were amused by her terror. "Eli?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Is that you?" The Wendigoon tilted its head, its yellow eyes never leaving hers. Then, in a voice that was no longer her brother's, it spoke. "Eli is mine," it said, its voice a rasping echo that seemed to come from every direction. "And now, so are you." Sarah stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew now what the creature wanted. It didn't just take people, it took souls. It fed on the fear of those who dared to enter its domain, and once it had you, it would never let go. The Wendigoon took a step toward her, its limbs cracking like dry wood. Sarah turned and ran, her flashlight beam dancing wildly in the darkness as she sprinted through the trees. But no matter how fast she ran, she knew it would follow. It always followed. And as the Wendigoon's distorted laugh echoed in the distance, Sarah realized something. The woods had never let her go. It was never just her brother that the forest had taken. It had been waiting for her. The Wendigoon's mark. There were certain things in life that couldn't be explained. Some things were better left in the realm of myth, tucked safely away where they couldn't hurt anyone. But when Max had moved to the sleepy town of Clearwater, he quickly realized that not all myths stayed in the past. Some were too dangerous, too real, to be forgotten. Max had moved to Clearwater in search of peace, tired of the noise and chaos of city life. He had found a small cabin nestled at the edge of the forest, far enough from the main roads to enjoy solitude, but close enough to town to feel connected. The locals seemed nice enough, though they were a bit reserved, especially when the subject of the woods came up. They were polite, but always changed the subject when Max asked about the large, dense forest that bordered the town. It wasn't until the first autumn night that Max began to understand why. It had been a long day of unpacking and settling into the cabin. The sun had set, and the woods outside were already casting long shadows into the cabin's windows. Max had just started a fire when he noticed something strange. A distant sound, a low, almost imperceptible hum carried on the breeze. He had heard it before, he realized, while he was out walking earlier in the day. At the time, he had dismissed it as just the wind, but now it seemed different. The sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Curious, Max opened the front door, the cold night air rushing in. He stood on the porch for a moment, listening. The hum seemed to grow louder, and then he heard it clearly. A voice. Max. The voice was faint but unmistakable. It was his name, spoken in a way that sounded almost like someone calling from just beyond the trees. Max froze, his heart skipping a beat. "Max!" the voice called again, a little louder this time, filled with an eerie familiarity. Max stepped forward, peering into the dark woods. He didn't recognize the voice, but something about it stirred something deep in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite place. The voice was gentle, almost coaxing. It was calling him, beckoning him into the forest. "Max, come closer." He felt a sudden chill crawl down his spine. He knew he shouldn't go. He had read enough about the myths in Clearwater to know that the forest wasn't something you ventured into at night. But the voice had a pull to it, a power that made it hard to resist. For a moment he stood there, caught in the strange, hypnotic call. But then something inside him clicked. The voice wasn't right. It wasn't natural. He had heard enough stories from the townsfolk, stories of disappearances, strange sounds, and tales of a creature that haunted the woods. The Wendigoon. The thought sent a rush of adrenaline through his body. Max slammed the door shut, locking it behind him, and turned to go to bed. But as he stepped away from the window, he heard a new sound, cracking twigs, snapping branches, heavy footsteps. Something large was moving in the trees. His heart raced. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He wasn't imagining it. Something was out there, something that was getting closer. Max rushed to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. His breath caught in his throat. It was there, standing just beyond the tree line, watching him. The creature was impossibly tall, its body unnaturally long, with limbs that seemed to bend in impossible angles. Its skin was ashen, stretched thin over its bones, and its face, if it could be called that, was a blank, smooth surface, dark pits where eyes should have been. But it had eyes, two glowing yellow ones, set deep into the featureless expanse of its head. They were fixed on Max, gleaming with an unnatural hunger. Max's stomach twisted with terror. He recognized it immediately. The Wendigoon. The stories he had heard, the warnings whispered behind closed doors, all flooded back to him in an instant. It was real. It wasn't a myth. It wasn't a tale to scare children. The Wendigoon was real, and it was standing outside his cabin. Max didn't wait. He ran to the back door, grabbing his coat and flashlight. His mind raced with thoughts of escape, but deep down he knew there was no running from this. The creature would chase him, catch him, and do whatever it did to people who were unfortunate enough to cross its path. But Max had to try. He had to get away. He threw open the back door and bolted into the yard, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The woods loomed around him, thick and endless. He could hear the Wendigoon's slow, deliberate movements behind him, like it was toying with him, letting him think he had a chance. His breath was ragged, his heart pounding in his chest. His feet slipped on the wet ground as he pushed through the underbrush. He had no idea where he was going, just that he needed to put distance between himself and that thing. But no matter how fast he ran, no matter how far he pushed himself, the Wendigoon was always there. Its presence looming just behind him, never stopping, never tiring. Max's mind raced, desperately searching for a way out, a way to escape, he had to think. There had to be something. And then he remembered. The mark. The townsfolk had spoken of it, quietly, with fear in their eyes. They said that the Wendigoon's mark was a curse, a sign that you were already claimed by the creature. People who had wandered into the woods, who had seen the Wendigoon or heard its voice, would return with strange symbols carved into their skin, marks that would never heal, marks that bound them to the creature. Max's heart sank. He reached up to touch his neck, and his fingers brushed against something smooth and strange. When he pulled his hand away, there was blood on his fingers. His skin was marked. The Wendigoon had already claimed him. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. There was no escape. The creature wasn't just hunting him, it had already chosen him. The mark meant that he was already its prey, and no matter how fast he ran or how far he went, it would always find him. In that moment, Max stopped running. He knew he couldn't outrun the Wendigoon. He couldn't hide from it. The only thing left was to face it. Turning around, he held the flashlight up, the beam trembling in his hand as he shone it into the darkness. The creature was standing just a few feet away, its yellow eyes gleaming in the night. "Max," it whispered, its voice echoing in his mind, the same soothing, coaxing tone that had first called him into the woods, and then it stepped forward. Max closed his eyes, bracing himself for the inevitable. The Wendigoon was here, and now it was time to claim him. The Wendigoon's Watcher. Samantha Harlow had always been drawn to the wilderness. A longtime lover of hiking and camping, she had grown up in the city but spent as much time as she could in the nearby woods. She found peace in the quiet solitude, the stillness of the trees, and the sound of birds overhead. But her recent trip to the northern woods in the remote part of Michigan would change everything. It had been an ordinary trip at first, a weekend hike to clear her mind. The weather was perfect, crisp air, the sun just beginning to dip below the horizon. She had planned to spend the night at a small campground that sat on the edge of the forest. Nothing too far in, just a few miles from civilization. At least, that's what she told herself. But that was before she heard the first whisper. Samantha had just finished setting up her tent and was sitting by the fire, enjoying the flickering warmth when she heard it. Soft, almost like the wind, but there was something distinctly human about it. Sam? She stiffened, her heart skipping a beat. Her name. It was quiet, but it was unmistakable. Sam. She looked around, half expecting someone to step out from behind the trees, someone from the nearby campgrounds. But the woods were empty, the trees standing tall like silent sentinels. A shiver crawled up her spine. The sound was so close now, like a whisper in her ear. Yet, no one was there. The voice was distant, but it was hers. Their tone, their cadence, everything. She stood, the firelight casting long shadows across the clearing as she moved cautiously toward the trees. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling slightly. "Is someone there?" No answer. The forest was unnaturally quiet now, the rustling of leaves gone, as if it were holding its breath. Samantha hesitated, feeling a strange pull toward the woods. She shook her head, muttering under her breath. It must be some animal mimicking a voice, but deep down, she knew. She knew what the stories were, what people had warned about. Don't go too deep in the woods. Don't listen to the voice. Don't follow it. She had heard the stories growing up, warnings about the Wendigoon, an ancient creature that roamed these woods, using voices of loved ones to lure people into its grasp. Some said it was a spirit, like others a twisted being of flesh and bone, but all of them agreed on one thing. It was never a good idea to go looking for it. Yet, there she was. Samantha shook her head, trying to dismiss the creeping dread. "It's nothing," she muttered to herself, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were watching her, waiting for her next move. The whisper came again. "Sam, come closer." It was closer this time, almost like it was coming from the trees and was just beyond the edge of the campfire's reach. She stood frozen for a moment, then her legs moved without her consent, drawn toward the sound. She hadn't meant to do it. She didn't want to follow, but it was too late. The voice was like a thread pulling her deeper into the woods. The forest was dark now, the only light coming from the faint glow of her flashlight, but it barely made a dent in the thick, oppressive darkness. She pushed through the underbrush, her breath coming faster as the voice grew louder. "Sam, just come closer. I'm waiting." The voice was softer now, almost tender. It sounded like her mother, the way she used to call her when Samantha was younger. A sense of familiarity, of safety, tugged at her heart. But that sense of comfort quickly morphed into something more sinister as the woods seemed to close in around her. Then she saw it, a figure standing in the shadows, tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that stretched in unnatural angles. Its face, a smooth, featureless surface like a mannequin's, pale and stark against the dark back of the trees. And its eyes, two glowing yellow orbs that burned with an unearthly light, fixed directly on her. Samantha stopped, rooted to the spot, unable to move. The creature didn't approach her immediately. It simply watched, its head tilting slowly to the side as if studying her. The whisper came again, but this time, it wasn't a voice she recognized. "You're not afraid. Yet." The voice echoed in her mind, sending a wave of terror crashing over her. She knew then that it wasn't just mimicking voices, it was feeding on fear. The Wendigoon didn't just want to lure people in, it thrived on their dread, on their terror. The creature's long, spindly limbs shifted, its body twisting as it began to move toward her, slow and deliberate. Its movements were unnatural, like it was slipping in and out of reality. The air around her grew colder, the forest growing darker with each passing second. Samantha wanted to run. She knew she should, but her legs wouldn't move. She was paralyzed, caught in its gaze. The creature stopped a few feet away from her, its yellow eyes locked onto hers, unblinking. It made no sound as it reached toward her, its long fingers stretching out like skeletal branches. "Why do you come?" it whispered mighty, the voice now a blend of distorted tones, the sounds of her own fears. Samantha opened her mouth to speak, but her voice was caught in her throat. All she could do was stare, frozen by the creature's gaze. And then, just as it was about to touch her, something snapped within her, a primal, desperate instinct. She turned and ran, her legs finally responding, propelling her forward, away from the thing that had her in its grasp. Branches whipped against her face as she dashed through the forest, the glow of the campfire far behind her. The creature's footsteps were heavy in her ears, chasing her, growing closer with each stride. She could hear the faint hum of its distorted voice, urging her to slow down, to come back. "Sam, you cannot outrun me." She didn't dare look back. She ran harder, her breath ragged, her pulse pounding in her ears. The forest seemed to twist and warp around her, the path no longer familiar. She was lost. She stumbled, falling to the ground, but quickly scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide with terror. Then, through the trees ahead of her, she saw it. The faint glow of her campsite, just a few yards away. Samantha's legs burned with exhaustion, but she pushed herself forward, focusing only on the light ahead. When she finally burst through the tree line, she didn't stop. She ran straight into her tent, her hands shaking as she zipped it up tightly, sealing herself inside. The wind howled outside, the trees swaying, and she could still hear that soft, mocking whisper. "Sam? I'm always watching." The Wendigoon had been there, in the woods, watching her every step, and it wasn't going away. It would wait. It would always wait. Samantha sat in the darkness of her tent, trying to catch her breath, her heart racing. She was safe, for now, but the woods outside were quiet again, too quiet. She knew it wasn't over. The Wendigoon had seen her, and it wasn't finished. The Wendigoon's bait. The thick fog rolled in as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and burnt orange. A soft chill settled over the landscape, creeping into the bones of anyone still out in the open. The small town of Ash Hollow, nestled between mountains and dense woods, had seen more than its fair share of odd occurrences, but the stories people told of the Wendigoon were the ones whispered in the darkest corners. Lydia Carson had never paid much attention to the superstitions. She had always been a woman of logic, the sort who questioned everything and believed only in what could be proven. She had moved to Ash Hollow 6 months ago to escape the bustle of city life, hoping the isolation would provide her with the peace she so desperately sought. The town was small, quiet, and full of history, both good and bad. It wasn't until the strange occurrences began that she started to wonder if the stories about the Wendigoon were more than just old folklore. Lydia had been out for a walk that evening, taking a shortcut through the woods to clear her head. The path was well trodden, but as she walked deeper into the forest, the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. It was strange. She'd walked this path countless times without a second thought, but tonight, something felt different. The air was thick, heavy with moisture, and the birds had gone eerily silent. She quickened her pace, the growing unease making the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Her mind wandered back to the stories she had heard upon moving to Ash Hollow. The older residents talked about the Wendigoon like it was a real living thing. They spoke of the creature with fear, telling tales of it calling people into the woods with familiar voices, mimicking the sounds of loved ones, drawing them deeper into the trees until they were lost forever. Some claimed it had been in these woods for centuries. Others said it was something older than even that, something born from the very darkness of the forest itself. "Don't venture too deep," they had warned her, "and if you hear your name being called, don't answer." Lydia had dismissed their warnings as just old-fashioned superstition, until now. As she made her way down the path, Lydia's thoughts were interrupted by the faintest whisper, so faint that she almost convinced herself it was just the wind. But then the whisper grew louder. "Lydia!" Her breath caught in her throat. She stopped in her tracks, looking around. The woods were still, the trees standing like silent sentinels, and the ground was damp beneath her boots. But the voice, it was unmistakable. It was hers. "Lydia!" The voice called again, closer this time. It was soft and gentle, but there was something wrong about it. Something hollow. Lydia's heart pounded in her chest. She spun around, searching the shadows, but there was nothing. The woods stretched on in every direction, the trees twisting and bending, their branches creaking in the wind. "Lydia, please." It was her mother's voice this time, clear, desperate, as though she were calling out to her from just beyond the trees. Lydia's stomach churned. She knew it couldn't be her mother. Her mother had passed away years ago, but the voice was so real, so lifelike. It tugged at something deep inside her, pulling her forward, deeper into the woods. "Don't listen," Lydia whispered to herself. "It's not real. It's just a trick." But the voice kept calling her, growing louder with each passing moment. She took a cautious step forward, then another, her heart racing. She told herself to stop, to turn around and head back, but the pull was too strong. Something inside her urged her forward, drawing her deeper into the forest, away from the safety of the path. "Lydia?" The voice sounded almost like her mother, but now it was more distorted, warped, like it was coming from somewhere far away. Lydia's mind screamed at her to stop, to listen to the rational part of her that said this was dangerous. But her legs moved on their own, carrying her deeper into the woods. The trees began to close in, their branches intertwining above her head, blocking out the last traces of sunlight. The path had disappeared entirely, replaced by a labyrinth of gnarled roots and tangled underbrush. Lydia stumbled, her breath coming in short gasps, her pulse thundering in her ears. She couldn't stop now. She couldn't turn back. The voice was too compelling. It was just ahead, just around the bend, and she had to reach it. She had to see who or what was calling her. And then she saw it, a figure standing at the edge of a clearing. It was tall, taller than any human should be. Its limbs were impossibly long, bent at odd angles, like something not entirely of this world. The creature's body was shrouded in shadow, but its face, it had no face, just a smooth, featureless expanse of pale skin with two glowing yellow eyes that pierced the darkness. Lydia froze, her breath caught in her throat. The creature's eyes locked onto hers, and in that moment, she knew. This wasn't her mother. It wasn't anyone she knew. This was the Wendigoon. The creature didn't move, didn't make a sound. It simply stood there, watching her with those glowing eyes, its presence suffocating the air around her. She tried to back away, but her legs wouldn't respond. She was rooted to the spot. Then, the Wendigoon's voice filled her mind. Not a whisper, but a deep, echoing command. "Come closer, Lydia." The words were so compelling, so filled with dark promise, that Lydia found herself taking a step forward, then another. She didn't want to. She tried to stop, tried to scream, but the Wendigoon's presence was overwhelming, drowning out all reason. Her body moved against her will, carried forward by some unseen force. She was close now, so close she could feel the cold emanating from the creature, the air around it thick with ancient malice. It tilted its head, its yellow eyes narrowing as if it were studying her. Then, in a voice that was both hers and something else entirely, it whispered, "You're mine now, Lydia." The words rang in her ears, and suddenly she understood. The Wendigoon didn't just hunt to feed. It hunted to claim, to turn its prey into something like it, something lost, something twisted. The world around her began to blur, the edges of her vision fading into darkness as the creature's influence seeped deeper into her mind. She felt her will slipping away, her identity, her thoughts all swallowed by the creature's hunger. And then, with one final surge of strength, Lydia fought back. She closed her eyes, pushed away the voice, and broke free from the Wendigoon's grasp. She turned and ran, her legs finally obeying her as she sprinted through the forest, back to the path, back to the light. The Wendigoon didn't chase her. Not yet. But she could hear it, watching, waiting in the shadows. When Lydia finally stumbled back into the clearing, gasping for air, she realized something. The Wendigoon had left its mark. It had touched her, claimed her, and it would never let her go. And as the night grew darker, Lydia knew one thing for certain. The Wendigoon was still watching. The Wendigoon's Hollow. It was late autumn when Kyle finally decided to take the long-forgotten hiking trail that ran deep into the woods. The small town of North Hollow, where Kyle had grown up, was the kind of place where stories and rumors ran deeper than the rivers. Kyle had heard the tales his entire life, the Wendigoon, a shadowy creature that haunted the woods, feeding on fear, drawing its prey into the darkness. It was said to mimic voices, to lure you in with the sound of loved ones calling your name, then trap you forever in its cold grasp. But Kyle, like most of the younger generation, had dismissed the stories as simple folklore. His generation had grown up with the conveniences of modern life, the distractions of the internet and social media. Superstitions seemed silly to him now, relics of a time long past. Still, there was something about the woods that had always felt different, but he had put it out of his mind until today. The weather had been unseasonably warm for late October, with the sun hanging high in the sky, casting long shadows on the ground. Kyle had planned a simple solo hike to clear his mind. He had just gone through a rough breakup and needed to get away, to think without distractions. He had no intention of venturing too far, just enough to take in the sights and enjoy the quiet. The path he was following wound deeper into the woods than he had ever gone before, and soon the noise of the world began to fade behind him. The crunch of leaves beneath his boots was the only sound as he walked. The wind whispered through the trees, and the air grew cooler as the day passed. He hadn't seen a soul since leaving the town, and for some reason, it felt like he was walking in the footsteps of a long-forgotten past, a place where time had lost its meaning. That's when he first heard the voice. At first, it was just a faint rustling in the distance, like the sound of someone calling his name. He stopped, trying to locate the source of the noise. Kyle. His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't told anyone he was going hiking today. Who could be out here? Kyle. The voice was clearer now, though it still sounded distant, as if coming from the shadows of the trees. It wasn't just a voice, it was a feeling. A warmth, a familiarity that wrapped around his mind like comforting embrace. For a split second, it reminded him of his mother's voice, the way she used to call him in the mornings when he was a child. His throat tightened. He hadn't heard her voice in years. She'd passed away when he was younger, and hearing that sound again felt like an ache in his chest, a longing he couldn't escape. Listening. Kyle, come closer. There it was again, the unmistakable call, but now it was closer, beckoning him deeper into the woods. He knew the stories, the warnings about not following the voices, but the pull was undeniable. He stepped forward, almost without thinking. Mom, he called out, his voice trembling. The voice responded, clearer now, almost within arm's reach. Kyle, I'm here. Kyle froze. This wasn't right. The air grew cold, and the wind seemed to die down, leaving behind an unnatural stillness. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. The voice, this thing, was too real, too familiar. It was impossible, but he couldn't help himself. He turned around, looking back the way he had come. But everything seemed wrong now. The path he had been following was no longer there. The trees were closer together, forming an almost impenetrable wall around him. The shadows seemed to lengthen, stretching unnaturally, as if they were moving on their own. The faint whispering of the voice grew louder. Kyle, come to me. Without thinking, Kyle started walking in the direction of the voice. It was like he was walking in a dream, unable to stop himself. The forest was quiet now, too quiet, but the voice was all he could focus on. The closer he got, the colder it became, and soon the trees seemed to close in around him, trapping him in the dark. Kyle, the voice came from just beyond the trees, soft and pleading, but now there was an edge to it. Kyle pushed forward, his footsteps slow, hesitant. He was deep in the forest now, far from the trail. It felt like the very earth beneath his feet was shifting, changing with every step. And then he saw it. A figure, tall and shadowy, standing just beyond a cluster of trees. Its body was thin and stretched, its limbs too long, too angular. It stood perfectly still, its featureless face staring directly at him, its glowing yellow eyes piercing through the darkness. It was like a thing born of the night itself, something that didn't belong in this world. Kyle's breath caught in his throat. The creature was impossible. It shouldn't exist, but there it was, standing before him. The Wendigoon. The stories he had heard as a child flashed through his mind. The creature didn't just hunt its prey. It fed on fear, on the confusion, the disorientation of its victims, and now it was here, standing before him. Kyle, come closer, the voice urged, but this time it was different. It wasn't his mother anymore. It was something darker, distorted, a twisting echo of the past. It was the Wendigoon, using his memories to trap him. Kyle stood frozen, paralyzed by fear. He couldn't look away from its glowing eyes. He felt his heart racing in his chest, his body screaming to run, but his legs wouldn't move. Come, the creature whispered, its voice a low growl now. Be with me. It took a step forward, its limbs jerking unnaturally, too long, too fast, and for the first time, Kyle's body obeyed. He turned and bolted, running as fast as he could through the dense underbrush. The creature's distorted laugh echoed behind him, reverberating through the trees like 1,000 voices. The ground seemed to shift beneath his feet, the forest warping as he ran. He didn't dare look back. Every part of him screamed to run, to get away. The Wendigoon was still following, its limbs reaching, its hollow eyes fixed on him. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, but Kyle didn't stop. He ran until his chest burned and his legs ached. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, he broke through the trees. The edge of the forest was ahead, the moonlight cutting through the branches. He stumbled, gasping for air, into the clearing. He turned to look behind him, but there was nothing there. The Wendigoon was gone. Kyle collapsed to the ground, his breath ragged as he stared at the woods. His pulse raced, and he could feel the cold sweat on his skin. He had escaped, but he knew deep down that it wasn't over. The Wendigoon had let him go for now, but it would be back. It always came back. With trembling hands, Kyle pulled himself to his feet and started toward town. He knew he wouldn't be able to explain what had just happened. Who would believe him? The Wendigoon had marked him, though, and the creature would wait. It was patient. And Kyle had a feeling that one day it would call again, and this time he might not be able to resist. The Wendigoon's hollow eyes. It was just another ordinary Friday night when Amber Riley decided to hike the old trail through the forest. Her friends had warned her against it. Don't go too deep, they had said. The Wendigoon lives in those woods. But Amber, with her love for adventure and disregard for superstitions, had only laughed it off. Amber had always been drawn to the wild, the untamed. She had grown up in the small town of Thornhill, where the forests were dense and the mountains were jagged peaks against the horizon. It was a beautiful place, but it was also steeped in ancient stories. Stories her grandmother used to tell her late at night by the fire, stories about creatures lurking in the woods, about the shadows that moved on their own, and of course, the Wendigoon. It was the local legend, the thing parents warned their children about. The Wendigoon, an ancient creature of dark origins, with limbs too long, a body too thin, and eyes that could pierce the very soul. The elders spoke in hushed voices about it, how it hunted in the woods, mimicking the voices of the lost, the broken. It was said that once you heard it call your name, you were already lost. But Amber had never taken it seriously. After all, she was an adult now, not a child listening to ghost stories. The evening had begun like any other. Amber had finished her shift at the local diner and decided to take a walk to clear her mind. The moon was full, casting a silvery glow over the landscape as she made her way toward the edge of the forest. The wind was light, rustling the leaves above her as she ventured deeper along the trail. The further she went, the quieter it became. The chirping of the night insects faded into a deep silence that felt unsettling. She paused for a moment, her breath visible in the cool air. It was then that she heard it. Amber. The voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. It sounded just like her mother. Amber froze, her pulse quickening. Her mother had died 5 years ago, but the voice, it was so real. It was the kind of voice that could bring back every memory she had ever held. Amber took a cautious step forward, then another. The trees ahead seemed to part slightly, revealing a narrow path leading deeper into the woods. Amber, come closer. It was the same voice, but this time there was a subtle distortion to it, as though something was wrong. Amber took another step forward, her feet moving on their own despite the rising fear in her chest. She had heard the warnings. The Wendigoon mimicked voices, drawing people in with a familiar sound, only to devour them once they were too far into the woods to escape. But it was her mother's voice. It had to be. Her heart beat faster, the pull to go deeper into the forest growing stronger. "Mom?" Amber called out, her voice trembling. "Mom, is that really you?" The voice answered, louder now, almost pleading. "Amber, please." She stepped further into the woods, her eyes scanning the darkness. The trees seemed to close in around her, the path twisting and turning in unnatural ways. The familiar trail was gone. The forest had changed. Amber. The voice was so close now. It felt as though it was coming from just behind her. Amber whipped around, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The air grew colder. The whispering voice came again. "Amber, come closer. I'm waiting." And that's when she saw it. At first, it was just a flicker at the edge of her vision. A shadow too large to be human, its silhouette bending and shifting in ways that weren't possible. But as she turned her head, she saw the creature fully. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with thin limbs that seemed to stretch out like tree branches. Its body was almost skeletal, its skin pale and drawn tight over its bones, and its face, Amber couldn't make it out fully. It was featureless, smooth, with only two glowing yellow eyes staring at her from the darkness. The Wendigoon. Amber's breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be. This was just a story. It had to be. But there it was, standing in front of her, its eyes burning through the night, staring deep into her soul. The voice came again, now distorted and wrong. Amber, come closer. She wanted to run. Every part of her screamed to turn around and flee, but her feet were rooted to the ground. The creature's gaze held her, paralyzed, unable to move. Come closer. It's time. The voice was louder now, ringing in her head, twisting her thoughts, pulling her deeper into the creature's grip. She could feel its presence crawling beneath her skin, a weight pressing down on her chest. The world seemed to tilt, the forest bending around her as the creature's long, spindly limbs stretched forward, its fingers reaching for her. Without thinking, Amber jerked back. Her legs finally obeyed, and she stumbled, turning and running as fast as she could through the woods. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her flashlight flickering in the darkness. The trees seemed to close in around her, the path twisting and shifting, leading her deeper into the heart of the forest. The Wendigoon was behind her, its footsteps echoing in the distance, but it didn't chase her. Not yet. It was toying with her, letting her think she had a chance. Amber, the voice called again, now twisted into something guttural, inhuman. Come to me. The creature was patient. It didn't need to chase her. It would wait. Amber kept running, but her legs were growing weaker, her chest aching as she stumbled over roots and rocks. Her flashlight flickered again, casting long, trembling shadows across the trees. The Wendigoon's voice was getting closer, and Amber could feel its eyes on her, even if she couldn't see it. With every step, the forest seemed to warp, the trees bending in impossible ways. She felt as though the forest itself was shifting, trapping her, closing in from all sides. And then, just as she thought she couldn't run any longer, the clearing appeared in front of her. The moonlight shone through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. She sprinted forward, not daring to look back, until she broke through the trees and into the open. The woods were silent again, but the air still felt heavy with something she couldn't name. She stood in the clearing, gasping for breath, staring back at the dark line of trees she had just come from. The Wendigoon was gone. The Wendigoon's path. The dense woods surrounding the town of Miller's Creek had always held a strange allure for Adam. Growing up, he and his friends would dare each other to venture into the dark, twisted trees on the outskirts of town. They told each other stories of things that lurked in the woods, strange creatures, shadows that moved on their own, and whispers that followed you, even when you were alone. But it wasn't until Adam returned home after years away that he began to take those stories seriously. Miller's Creek had changed in the years since he'd left. The once thriving town now looked worn, tired, as though time itself had forgotten it. The old mill that had given the town its name was abandoned, its wooden beams rotting and the machinery rusted beyond repair. The streets were quieter now, and the people even quieter. They spoke little of the past, and when Adam tried to ask about the old tales, the ones that kept the town's children from wandering too far, no one would answer. They just stared at him, their eyes wide, their lips tight. One evening, as the autumn chill began to creep into the air, Adam found himself standing on the porch of the old house he had grown up in, staring at the tree line. The woods, which had once felt like a mysterious playground, now seemed ominous. Something about them felt wrong, like they were watching him. He shook off the uneasy feeling and grabbed his jacket. He had spent years away in the city, working, building a life, and he knew the only way to finally rid himself of the unease was to face the woods, face the darkness. There had always been talk about the Wendigoon, the creature said to haunt these very forests. No one had ever seen it, of course, but it was said to lure people into the woods with voices, mimicking those of loved ones, calling them deeper and deeper until they were lost forever. Adam knew the stories, but they were just that, stories, nothing more. Yet as he crossed the yard, heading toward the trail that led into the forest, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him. The path was familiar, though the underbrush had grown wild in the years since he had last walked it. The towering trees formed an almost impenetrable canopy, blocking out the last light of the setting sun. The air felt thick with anticipation, as if the woods themselves were waiting for something to happen. Adam moved forward, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. His breath came in steady puffs, visible in the cold air. He'd walked this path countless times as a child, never once feeling afraid. But tonight, the woods felt alive, and it was as if they were closing in on him. After a few minutes, Adam heard it, the faintest sound. A whisper, so soft it could have been the wind. But it wasn't the wind. The voice was clear, though distorted, calling his name. Adam. His heart skipped a beat. He stopped dead in his tracks, the hair on the back of his neck standing up. There was no mistaking it. It was his name, and it had come from the trees. Adam. The voice came again, this time more distinct, filled with a pleading, familiar tone. His mother. It sounded just like his mother. "Mom?" Adam called out, his voice shaking. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. She had passed away years ago. How could she be here? "Come closer, Adam," the voice continued, soft and coaxing. "I'm waiting for you." Adam's breath caught in his throat. The words were wrong. The voice was wrong. There was something off about it. Something deep in his gut, telling him to turn around, to run back to the safety of the town. But instead, his feet moved on their own, drawn to the sound. He had to see for himself. He had to know if it was really his mother. With each step, the air grew colder. The trees seemed to grow taller, their twisted limbs stretching out like hands reaching for him. The voice grew louder, more urgent, and Adam's pulse quickened. He was almost there, just around the bend in the path. He could see the dark shapes of the trees ahead, but the voice was fading, replaced by a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down his spine. And then he saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing in the shadows of the trees. Its limbs were far too long, bending and twisting in unnatural angles. It had no face, just a smooth, featureless surface, but its eyes, two bright yellow orbs, gleamed from the darkness, locking onto him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. The Wendigoon. Adam froze, his breath caught in his throat. The creature stood motionless, its body contorting in ways that defied nature, as if it were made from the shadows themselves. And then, in a voice that was both familiar and alien, it spoke again. "Come closer, Adam. You're already lost." The words were like ice in his veins, and before he could react, the creature moved. Its long limbs stretched forward, impossibly fast, and it was upon him in an instant. Adam spun around and ran, his legs pumping furiously, but the Wendigoon was faster, always a step behind, its limbs cracking like dry branches as it moved through the forest. The voice called out to him again, a distorted version of his mother's voice, urging him forward, pulling him deeper into the woods. "Adam, don't run. Come to me." He had heard the stories. He knew what would happen if he didn't escape. The Wendigoon didn't just kill its victims. It took them, absorbed them into the darkness, trapping them in a never-ending nightmare. He could feel its presence closing in, and he knew he had to get out. But the path was gone. The trees had closed in on him, and the air was thick with a darkness that seemed to swallow everything around him. He was lost. He was already lost. He stumbled, falling to his knees, gasping for air. His mind raced, but all he could hear was the creature's voice, closer now, its laugh echoing in his ears. And then the woods fell silent. The Wendigoon had stopped. Adam looked up, his breath ragged. The creature stood before him, its glowing eyes fixed on him as it reached down with one long, bony hand. It didn't need to speak. It didn't need to say anything at all. It had him. The forest had claimed him. But before the Wendigoon could take its final step, something shifted in the air, something cold and ancient, and with one final surge of adrenaline, Adam pushed up to his feet and ran, the darkness of the forest closing in behind him, but the light of the town just ahead. The Wendigoon would wait. It would always wait. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with me tonight. Remember, the forest is always watching, waiting for those brave or foolish enough to listen. If you enjoyed tonight's tale, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, keep the light close and never wander too far into the unknown. The Wendigoon is always closer than you think.